And we're back. So another next reading on our list is a graphic novel actually called Martha Washington, Give Me Liberty. And this graphic novel is interesting for a number of reasons. Um, when we talk about the turn towards um, sort of popularity of comics in the 1980s, there are actually two graphic novels that you know about. I mentioned before Batman, The Dark Knight Returns, and The Watchmen, both of which have been adapted numerous times in the films. The latest version of The Dark Knight Returns was Batman vs. Superman. And then The Watchmen, of course, was an HBO TV series. Um, the Dark Knight Returns was actually written by Frank Miller and written and drawn by Frank Miller, and then Watchmen was created by Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons. When we talk about the history of comics, these two comics are really important, uh, even though they both came out as individual issues or what they call in the comic industry floppies. These comics were combined into trade paperbacks and really helped to spark the modern graphic novel market. So they were both published around 1986. Batman: The Dark Knight Returns came out first, and then Watchmen came out that same year. And then they were both sort of combined into those trade paperbacks and have never been out of print since. And for both of these creators, I mean, these are sort of seminal works. And Frank Miller goes on to really um, create another independent piece working with Dave Gibbons, and that is Martha Washington, Give Me Liberty, An American Dream. So I want to show you a little clip that sort of talks about a little bit about the character.
Well, but for whatever reason, we really felt like a superhero, not a celebrity, but a superhero would be someone who could embody the things that we were trying to do. So we did all of this online research, and no one really fit. There was Storm, and she was just it was too fantastical, right? It was like a fantasy. No one could relate to that. This idea of this woman with the white hair and blue eyes, and it didn't really resonate with the young women. And these were young women who were living in a homeless shelter. So we came upon Martha Washington, and everything just split wide open. So Martha Washington, this regular girl, right? This regular girl who grows up in Cabrini Green projects in Chicago. And she's not a brilliant student, and she's not a horrible student. She's somewhere in the middle. She's just a regular student trying to make her way in the world. And through a series of circumstances, takes on the role of a leader, becomes this hero, and then becomes this like superhuman force who's able to mobilize people, right? And so through the story of Martha Washington, which starts off really regular in a lot of ways, and then she becomes this fantasy figure, similar to the way Storm was initially, but that fantasy for the young women felt real because of where she came from and because what she represented to them. As this person who comes from a place that is very familiar to them and is able to do through sheer force of what is right, a value system and resilience and just being strong, was able to be this cult leader, right, in the comic strip. So that's how I came to Martha Washington.
So the story of Martha Washington, as you will see, is very much one grounded in the politics of the 1980s. It is a futurist tale, and I often characterize it as sort of taking on elements of an Afrofuturist story. There's a black female protagonist, as that clip indicates. She grows up in Cabrini Green, and this is in a sort of future landscape where there are a number of sort of like allusions here that actually might resonate a little bit in terms of sort of sci-fi themes. There's a great irony here in terms of the idea of this as a feminist comic, but I think one of the reasons I wanted you to sort of experience this story is because of its black female protagonist, that it has these elements of Afrofuturism that sort of offered by a kind of seminal creator of the 1980s, who we very much associate with innovation in American comics. And he very much admires this as a product. If you read about Frank Miller, he sees the sort of value statements represented by Martha Washington aligning very closely, not just simply with African American experience, but really the experience of working class people across the United States. And so there's a tension here about the idea of what can this sort of black female protagonist sort of represent in terms of like questions of power dynamics and oppression and patriarchy, and how with especially these two creators that we so closely associate with um, sort of modernity and relevance in comics, how do those things sort of play themselves out in the context of the story? So this represents a kind of very early, I think, in some ways, again, taking on some of these questions of what are alternative, what are sophisticated comic narratives that are being produced in the 1980s and 1990s. What are they aiming to do, and what are the issues that it's going to bring to the fore, and how do they sort of reflect some of these broader questions around race, class, and gender? And this is a great comic to sort of think about that. When I come back, I'll talk a little bit about a more contemporary narrative called Bitch Planet.